The chamber was enormous beyond human comprehension, and it stretched for kilometers in every direction with floating platforms, carrying delegates from 4,000 different species that had ruled the galaxy for 11 million years. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood alone on her small platform as it drifted toward the center of the vast space, and she could feel 12,000 alien eyes watching her with a mixture of curiosity and something that felt very much like pity. She had been told this was a routine review and nothing to worry about, and just a standard procedure that all new species went through after joining the galactic community. The Galactic Concordance had maintained peace across 3 galactic arms through a simple system they called biological efficiency ratings, and every species was measured and cataloged and assigned a value based on how useful they were to the greater whole. Humanity had crawled out of their single solar system only 80 years ago using crude fusion drives and stubborn determination, and they had been welcomed into the galactic community with polite smiles and quiet condescension. Elena had spent 15 years as Earth's ambassador, and she had learned to recognize the way other species looked at humans, and it was the same way a person might look at a child who insisted they could run with the adults. The High Arbiter floated down from the highest platform, and its body was made of living crystal that caught light and scattered it in rainbow patterns across the chamber, and it was beautiful in a cold and distant way. The Luminari had transcended their biological forms 3 million years ago, and they had guided the Concordance ever since with wisdom that came from watching countless civilizations rise and fall. Species 7241C, the High Arbiter announced, and its voice resonated through the chamber without any visible source. Designation Homo sapiens has completed its assessment period. Elena straightened her spine and kept her face neutral, even as something cold began to settle in her stomach. The Biological Efficiency Council has reviewed all data pertaining to humanity. The High Arbiter continued. Physical assessment indicates fragile skeletal structure and excessive sleep requirements and limited sensory range, and an average lifespan of less than 100 standard years. Murmurs rippled through the assembled delegates, and Elena heard what might have been laughter from somewhere to her left. Cognitive assessment indicates high redundancy in neural processing and inefficient memory storage and emotional interference in logical functions. The crystal being listed, each failing. Without emotion, resource consumption ratio has been calculated at 400% above sustainable levels for a species of humanity's development stage. Elena's hands curled into fists at her sides, but she kept her expression calm, because she had been trained for difficult moments, and this was just another test. The Council's final determination is as follows. The High Arbiter raised one crystalline limb, and the entire chamber fell silent. Biological efficiency rating of 3%, and cognitive redundancy of 94%, an overall species viability assessment of non-sustainable. The cold feeling in Elena's stomach turned to ice. The Galactic Concordance therefore finds humanity to be obsolete. The word echoed through the chamber, and Elena felt it hit her like a physical blow, and around her the delegates began to murmur and nod, as if this was expected and reasonable, and just another item on their agenda. Earth and all human colonies will be scheduled for reclamation. The High Arbiter continued. Humanity is granted one standard galactic cycle, which equals approximately 4 Earth years to achieve peaceful dissolution and the Concordance. Thanks you for your brief contribution to galactic diversity. Elena stood frozen on her platform as the delegates began to disperse, and she watched them float away, discussing other matters and making plans for lunch and treating the extinction of her entire species as nothing more than routine business. Peaceful dissolution. The words burned in her mind, and she understood what they meant because she had studied the Concordance's history, and she knew what happened to species that were declared obsolete. They were expected to stop reproducing and to dismantle their civilization piece by piece, and to walk quietly into extinction while the galaxy watched and recorded it for their archives. 4 years to convince 8 billion people to simply accept death. Ambassador Vasquez, the High Arbiter, had not moved from its position, and its crystal form flickered with what might have been curiosity. "You may return to Earth to deliver our decision." Elena looked up at the being that had just sentenced her species to death, and she felt something shift inside her chest, and it was not fear or despair, but something older and darker. "I have a question," she said, and her voice was steady. "You may ask, what happens if we refuse?" The chamber went quiet, and the delegates who had been leaving stopped and turned back, and Elena could feel their attention focusing on her like a physical weight. The High Arbiter's crystal form flickered again, and this time, Elena recognized it as surprise. "Refuse," it repeated as if the word was foreign. "Yes," Elena said. "What happens if humanity does not accept peaceful dissolution? And what if we choose to keep living?" "That is not an option that has been offered." "I understand that," Elena replied. "But I'm asking what happens if we take it?" Anyway, the silence stretched, and Elena watched the High Arbiter process her question, and she saw the moment when the ancient being realized that in 11 million years of declaring species obsolete, no one had ever asked this question before. Then, the Concordance would be forced to enforce its decision. The High Arbiter finally answered, as it is always done with species that resist optimization. "How?" Elena pressed. "How exactly would you enforce it?" More flickering from the crystal form, and Elena thought she might be seeing the luminary equivalent of discomfort. "The Concordance has methods that have proven effective for millions of years," was the only answer. Elena smiled, and it was not a warm smile, and it was not a diplomatic smile, and it was the kind of smile that her ancestors had worn when facing impossible odds. "I will relay your message to Earth," she said, "but I should warn you of something first." "And what is that, Ambassador?" Elena looked around the chamber at the thousands of species that had just voted to exterminate her people, and she memorized their faces and their forms and their smug certainty that this was already over. "Humans have never been very good at dying quietly," she said. "We have a tendency to make it everyone's problem." She activated her platform's controls and began to drift toward the exit, and she did not look back at the High Arbiter or the delegates or the vast chamber that had witnessed so many species accept there. And with dignity, behind her, the High Arbiter watched the small human woman leave, and for the first time in 3 million years it felt something it could not quite identify. It would take the Luminari 4 years to realize that the feeling had been a warning. The transmission reached Earth at 3 in the morning Greenwich Mean Time, and within 1 hour, every major government had been woken from sleep, and within 6 hours, the entire planet knew that they had been sentenced to death. Elena Vasquez stood before the United Earth Council in Geneva, and she played the recording of the High Arbiter's verdict, and she watched the faces of the most powerful humans alive as they heard the word obsolete. Some of them went pale, and some of them wept, and some of them sat in stunned silence as if they could not quite believe what they were hearing. Chancellor Morrison of the European Federation was the first to speak, and his voice shook with barely controlled rage. "They cannot do this," he said. "We have rights under the Galactic Charter, and we have contributed to their science and their culture, and we have followed every rule they gave us. The Charter does not protect obsolete species," Elena replied, and she kept her voice flat because emotion would not help them now. "We were never members of the Concordance, and we were guests, and guests can be asked to leave. Then we negotiate," said President Chun of the Asian Coalition. "We offer them something valuable, and we make ourselves useful, and we prove that we deserve to exist." "I spent 15 years trying to do exactly that," Elena said. "They have already decided what we are worth, and the answer is nothing." The debates went on for 9 days, and Elena watched them argue and plead and bargain with each other as if any of it would matter to the beings who had already written humanity's obituary. Some delegates argued for building hidden colony ships and scattering human survivors to the dark spaces between stars, where the concordance might not look, and others suggested surrender and acceptance because fighting the entire galaxy was clearly impossible. On the 9th day, General Yuki Tanaka requested permission to address the council, and Elena watched her walk to the podium with the calm confidence of someone who had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Tanaka was small and compact with gray hair cut short and eyes that had seen combat on 3 different worlds before humanity had even reached the stars. For 80 years, she began, we have watched the concordance, and we have studied every species we encountered, and we have smiled and nodded and played the role of grateful newcomers while our observers recorded everything. She activated a holographic display in the chamber, filled with images of alien fleets and homeworlds, and the complex web of alliances that held the concordance together. In that time, we learned something that the concordance never bothered to hide because they did not think anyone was paying attention. The display shifted to show military records and fleet movements in battle, statistics that stretch back millions of years. They have not fought a real war in 4 million years. Tanaka said, their weapons are ceremonial relics that have not been fired in generations, and their strategies are theoretical exercises taught in schools but never tested in combat, and their soldiers have never seen blood. The council chamber was silent, and Elena could see the representatives leaning forward in their seats. The concordance maintains order through fear of their reputation and nothing else. Tanaka continued, they are an empire built on the memory of power and not power itself. Chancellor Morrison raised his hand, and his face was thoughtful now instead of frightened. What exactly are you proposing, General? Tanaka smiled, and it was the same kind of smile Elena had worn in the concordance chamber 60 years ago. The military leadership of Earth recognized that we were vulnerable, she said. We were newcomers in a galaxy ruled by ancient powers, and we had no leverage and no allies and no way to protect ourselves if those powers decided we were inconvenient. She pulled up new images showing facilities that did not appear on any official records, and ships with designs that had never been seen in public, and weapons that made the council members gasp. Project Prometheus was our insurance policy, Tanaka said. We have spent 60 years building in secret and training in secret and preparing for the day when the galaxy would turn against us. You built a military without authorization, President Chen said, and his voice was more curious than angry. We built a survival mechanism, Tanaka corrected, and now that mechanism is ready to be used. Elena stepped forward because she needed to understand exactly what Tanaka was proposing. How long would you need? She asked. The concordance gave us 4 years. Tanaka's smile grew wider, and there was something almost predatory in her expression. Ambassador Vasquez, we do not need 4 years, and we do not need 4 months, she said. Project Prometheus has been ready for deployment since before you took your first diplomatic posting. Ready for what exactly? Chancellor Morrison asked. For war. Tanaka replied simply. The kind of war the concordance has forgotten how to fight, and the kind of war that humanity has been perfecting since we first picked up rocks and threw them at each other. She turned to address the entire council, and her voice filled the chamber. They declared us obsolete because we are inefficient and emotional and short-lived, she said. They think those are weaknesses, but they have never seen what an inefficient, emotional, short-lived species does when it has nothing left to lose. The galaxy will unite against us, someone called from the back of the chamber. We cannot defeat 4,000 species. We do not need to defeat them, Tanaka answered. We need to make them understand that destroying us will cost more than they are willing to pay, and we need to show them that the peaceful dissolution they expect will never happen. She looked around the room at the leaders who held humanity's fate in their hands. "The Concordance thinks this is already over," she said. "They think we will argue and weep, eventually accept our end like every other species before us, and that is their mistake." Elena thought about the High Arbiter's surprise when she asked what would happen if humanity refused, and she realized that Tanaka was right. "What do you need from us?" Elena asked. "Authorization," Tanaka replied, "and time to brief you on what we have built." Deep beneath the Siberian permafrost, machines that had slept for decades began to wake, and in orbital facilities hidden among asteroid debris, crews began final preparations, and across human space, soldiers who had trained their entire lives for a war they hoped would never come received a single message: Prometheus is active. The galaxy had given humanity 4 years to die quietly, and humanity had decided to make some noise instead. The Concordance expected humanity to wither like a plant cut from its roots, and they sent observation drones to Earth and its colonies to document the peaceful dissolution they were certain would come. What the drones recorded, instead, made no sense to the analysts who reviewed the footage. Earth's orbital shipyards, which had been quiet for decades, suddenly blazed with activity, and massive structures took shape in the darkness between planets, and resource extraction from the asteroid belt increased by 400% in a single month. Strange energy signatures bloomed across human space, and the readings matched nothing in Concordance databases. And when officials requested explanations, the humans simply smiled and said they were making preparations. The High Arbiter sent a formal inquiry demanding to know what preparations could possibly be necessary for a species that had already been declared obsolete. Ambassador Vasquez's response was a single word that the Concordance did not understand: Prometheus. 3 months after the verdict, 17 worlds belonging to the Kreth species went dark in a single hour. The Kreth were an insectoid race who had been among the loudest voices calling for humanity's obsolescence, and they had mocked human biology in the Great Chamber and laughed at the idea that such fragile creatures deserved to share the stars. They were not laughing anymore. Human ships tore through Kreth defensive fleets with a speed and violence that the Concordance had not seen in 4 million years, and these were not the clumsy vessels that humanity had used to reach the stars. 80 years ago, these ships moved like predators, and their weapons cut through Kreth armor as if it was paper, and their pilots flew with a reckless aggression that Concordance tacticians could not predict or counter. The Kreth had always believed that superior numbers would win any conflict, and they outnumbered the human fleet 10 to 1. And they were certain that mathematics would save them, but the humans did not fight like the Concordance expected. They did not engage in the elegant maneuvers and calculated exchanges that galactic warfare had become over millions of years, and they did not seek strategic positions or negotiate pauses for resupply. They attacked like fire spreading through dry grass, and they hit targets simultaneously across multiple systems, and they accepted casualties that would have been unthinkable for any other species. General Tanaka commanded the assault from her flagship, Prometheus Unbound, and she watched the battle unfold across dozens of holographic displays. And she saw the moment when the Kreth command structure began to collapse. "They do not know how to respond," her tactical officer reported. "Their communications are chaos, and their admirals are contradicting each other, and 3 of their home fleet commanders have abandoned their posts. They have never faced an enemy that was willing to die to hurt them." Tanaka replied, "They thought war was a game with rules and points and acceptable losses." She leaned forward in her command chair. "Show them what war really is." Human soldiers landed on Kreth worlds, and they fought in the streets and the tunnels and the hive structures that no other species had ever tried to penetrate, and they fought hand to hand with weapons and fists and teeth when necessary. The Concordance watched in horror, and they had forgotten that war could be this brutal and this personal, and this terrifying. Human special forces infiltrated Kreth leadership compounds and eliminated commanders in their sleep, and they left messages written in Kreth blood on the walls, warning that no one was safe. Human hackers broke into Kreth communication networks and spread false orders and panic, and they turned the great hive mind against itself with lies and confusion. Within 3 months, the Kreth begged for surrender, and they offered anything humanity wanted, if only the killing would stop. General Tanaka accepted their surrender, and she was not gentle about the terms. The galaxy watched in stunned silence, and species that had dismissed humanity as obsolete began to realize that they had made a terrible mistake. Emergency sessions were called across the Concordance, and ancient weapons were retrieved from museums and monuments, where they had been displayed as historical curiosities, and fleets that had not been mobilized in millions of years received orders to prepare for combat. The High Arbiter addressed the Concordance in a broadcast that reached every inhabited system. The situation with humanity has become complicated, it announced. Their response to our verdict has been unexpected, but the Concordance remains united, and we will not be intimidated by a single species that refuses to accept its proper place. But even as the Luminari spoke, humanity's fleets were already moving toward their next targets. Ambassador Vasquez sent her own message to every species in the Concordance, and her words were broadcast on every frequency. "You voted to exterminate us," she said. "You called us obsolete and worthless, and you expected us to die quietly, like good little primitives." Her face was calm, but her eyes were cold. "We are coming for everyone who raised their hand against humanity," she continued. "Not because we want war, but because you left us no choice, and because we refused to go gently into the darkness you prepared for us. You can stand against us and share the fate of the Kreth," she finished, "or you can step aside and let us deal with those who started this. And the choice is yours, but you should make it quickly." Across the galaxy, species that had confidently voted for humanity's extinction began to reconsider their positions. The Concordance had maintained peace through fear for 11 million years, but now there was something else to fear, and it was small and fragile and emotional, and absolutely unwilling to accept the judgment that had been passed upon it. Humanity was not going quietly, and the galaxy was about to learn what that meant. The Luminari had not known fear since before they abandoned their flesh bodies 3 million years ago, and they had watched empires rise and fall, and they had guided the galaxy through crises that lesser species could not even comprehend now. As 300 human warships surrounded their home system, they began to understand what fear felt like. The High Arbiter gathered with the other Luminari elders in their crystal citadel, and they watched the human fleet hold position just beyond their defensive perimeter, and they tried to calculate options that did not exist. "They should not have been able to reach us," one elder said, and its form flickered with agitation. "We had 14 defensive lines between our borders and theirs. They went through them," another replied. "Not around and not over, but through. And they did not stop to secure territory or consolidate gains, and they simply kept coming. The other species were supposed to slow them down," a third elder added. "We had treaties and alliances and mutual defense agreements." The High Arbiter's crystal form pulsed with something that might have been bitter amusement. The other species watched what humanity did to the Kreth. It said, "They decided that our treaties were not worth dying for." The human fleet had carved a path through the heart of the Concordance in just 8 months, and they had not conquered the species in their way, but had simply broken them and moved on worlds that had opposed. Humanity lay in ruins, and their infrastructure was destroyed, and their leadership was scattered or dead, and their populations were too shocked and traumatized to offer resistant. Species that had chosen neutrality watched the human ships pass and held their breath and prayed that the storm would not turn in their direction. And now that storm had reached the beings who had started it all. General Tanaka sat in her command chair aboard Prometheus Unbound and studied the Luminari homeworld on her tactical display, and she felt nothing but cold satisfaction. "Open a channel to the High Arbiter," she ordered. The communication connected and the High Arbiter's crystalline image appeared before her, and Tanaka could see the flickers and pulses that indicated the ancient being's emotional state. "General Tanaka," the High Arbiter said, "this situation has become unprecedented." "That is one word for it," Tanaka replied. "Surely we can negotiate." The luminary continued. "Humanity has proven its point, and you have demonstrated that you are not as weak as we believed, and the Concordance is prepared to reconsider its verdict." "Reconsider," Tanaka repeated, and her voice was flat. "Yes, and we can discuss terms that would allow humanity to continue existing within the galactic community, and perhaps with an elevated status to reflect your obvious capabilities." Tanaka leaned forward, and her eyes were hard. "You declared my species obsolete," she said. "You told 8 billion people that they were worthless and that they should quietly accept extinction, and you expected us to thank you for the 4 years you graciously allowed us before we were erased from existence. The verdict was based on standard assessment protocols." The High Arbiter replied, "It was not personal, not personal." Tanaka laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You sentenced children to death, and you told parents that their babies had no right to exist. And you did it with the same emotion you would used to file paperwork." She stood from her chair and walked closer to the holographic image. "Do you know what humans do when you threaten our children?" she asked. "We do not negotiate, and we do not calculate acceptable losses, and we burn everything to the ground and salt the earth so nothing can ever threaten them again." This is precisely the kind of emotional response that made humanity unsuitable for a galactic civilization, the High Arbiter said. And there was something almost like frustration in his voice. "You cannot simply destroy everything that offends you." "Watch us," Tanaka replied. She turned to her communications officer. "Begin the broadcast," she ordered. "Every frequency and every system, and I want every species in the galaxy to see this." The officer nodded, and within seconds Tanaka knew that her words were reaching billions of beings across thousands of worlds. "This is General Yuki Tanaka of the Human Defense Force," she announced. "I am speaking to every species that has lived under the Concordance's rule for the past 11 million years. She gestured toward the image of the luminary homeworld, surrounded by human ships. "The beings who judged you and controlled you and decided which of you deserved to exist are now helpless," she said. "The power that they held over you was an illusion built on fear and reputation and nothing else." The High Arbiter's form flickered rapidly. "What are you doing?" it demanded. "I am giving the galaxy a choice," Tanaka replied. "Something the Concordance never offered." She turned back to the broadcast. "Humanity did not come here to conquer," she continued. "We came here to survive, and to prove that no one has the right to decide which species deserves to exist. We could destroy the Luminari and everyone who supported our extinction," she said. "We have the power to do it, and after what they did to us, we would be justified." She paused and let the silence stretch. "But we are not going to become what they are," she said. "We are not going to build a new empire on the corpses of our enemies, because that would make us no better than the Concordance. Instead, we are offering a different path," she announced. "Any species that wants to build something new can stand with humanity, and we will create an alliance where no one is declared obsolete, and no one is forced to die quietly. And any species that wants to continue the old ways can stay with the Luminari and see how long their reputation protects them now." Across the galaxy, billions of beings watched and listened and began to make the most important decision of their civilization's history. The High Arbiter stared at Tanaka, and its crystal form had gone completely still. "You would spare us?" it asked, and there was genuine confusion in its voice. "After everything we did?" "Destroying you would be easy," Tanaka replied. "Making you irrelevant is much more satisfying." She cut the communication and turned to watch the responses begin to flood in from across the galaxy. One by one, species that had lived in fear of obsolescence ratings began to declare their allegiance to humanity, and the concordance that had ruled for 11 million years started to crumble, not through conquest, but through abandonment. 1 year had passed since the day humanity surrounded the luminary homeworld and offered the galaxy a choice, and in that time everything had changed. The concordance was gone, and not because humanity had destroyed it, but because species that had lived in fear for millions of years had simply walked away and joined something new. They called it the Human Compact, and it was built on a single founding principle that was carved into the walls of its assembly hall. In every language known to exist, every species has the right to exist. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood at the podium in the great chamber that had once been the heart of concordance power, and she looked out at representatives from 2,000 species who had chosen to build a new future. The chamber looked different now, and the floating platforms that had emphasized hierarchy and separation had been replaced with a single curved floor where every delegate stood at the same level, and the cold crystal lighting had been changed to something warmer and more welcoming. 1 year ago, Elena began. I stood in this chamber and listened to the High Arbiter declare humanity obsolete, and I watched 12,000 delegates nod and murmur their agreement, and I felt the weight of a death sentence fall on everyone I had ever known or loved. The chamber was silent, and every eye was focused on the small human woman who had survived that moment. They expected us to accept their judgment, she continued. They thought we would argue for a while and then quietly begin the process of peaceful dissolution, and they were certain that we would be erased from history within 4 years. She smiled, and this time it was warm instead of cold. They did not understand humans at all. Laughter rippled through the chamber, and it came from species that had once mocked humanity and now stood beside them as equals. We did not fight because we wanted war, Elena said. We fought because we refused to accept that any being has the right to decide who deserves to exist, and we fought because our children deserved a future, and because we would rather burn the galaxy down than watch them erased. General Tanaka stood at the back of the chamber with her arms crossed, and she watched the woman who had become the voice of humanity's new place in the galaxy. The fleet that had broken the concordance was being transformed, and warships were being converted to exploration vessels, and troop carriers were becoming colony ships, and weapons platforms were being repurposed for asteroid mining and construction. The weapons remained, of course, because humanity had learned that lesson. Well, and they would never again be caught unprepared. The old concordance believed in hierarchy and measurement and the cold logic of optimization, Elena continued. They ranked species like products on a shelf and discarded the ones they considered defective. She paused and looked around the chamber at the incredible diversity of beings who had gathered to build something new. The Human Compact believes in something else, she said. We believe in potential and growth and the idea that every species has something to contribute regardless of how efficient their biology might be. A delegate from the Dorothy raised one of its many tentacles, and Elena nodded for it to speak. The compact is young, the Dorothy said, and many of us were part of the concordance for millions of years. And what makes you believe this new alliance will last when so many others have failed? Elena considered the question carefully because it deserved a thoughtful answer. I cannot promise that the compact will last forever, she admitted. Nothing lasts forever, and pretending otherwise would be a lie. She stepped out from behind the podium and walked toward the center of the chamber. But I can tell you what makes humanity different, she said. We do not measure success by how long something survives, and we measure it by what we build and what we protect and what we leave behind for those who come after us. She gestured toward the chamber around them. The concordance lasted 11 million years, and in all that time they created nothing but fear. She said they optimized and measured and eliminated anything that did not fit their definition of worthy. In 1 year, the human compact has welcomed 2,000 species, she continued. We have begun exploration programs into regions of space that the concordance declared off-limits, and we have started research projects that would have been forbidden under the old efficiency ratings. A young human diplomat named Marcus Chun stood near the back of the chamber, beside a Kreth delegate named Vessel of Many Thoughts, and they had become friends during the negotiations that followed the war. Do you think it will work, Marcus? Whispered. This new alliance and everything we are trying to build. The Kreth turned its compound eyes toward the human and made the clicking sound that served as its species version of a thoughtful pause. Before humanity, I would have said. No, Vessel replied. Change is inefficient, and chaos is wasteful, and the old ways persist because they are optimal. And now, Marcus asked, now I think the galaxy is about to discover that optimal was always just another word for afraid. Elena had reached the center of the chamber, and she stood surrounded by beings who had tried to exterminate her species less than 2 years ago, and who now looked to humanity for leadership. The Luminari and the remaining supporters have retreated to a handful of systems at the edge of the galaxy, she said. They are isolated and ignored, and they will likely spend the rest of eternity wondering how they lost everything they built. She turned slowly to address every section of the chamber. We did not destroy them, she reminded the assembly. We could have, and no one would have blamed us, but we chose a different path. They wanted humanity to be a footnote in galactic history, she said. Instead, they became a lesson about what happens when you underestimate beings you consider beneath you. The galaxy called us obsolete, she concluded. They said we were too emotional and too fragile and too short-lived to matter. She smiled. And in her smile was every human who had ever been told they were not good enough. They forgot that short-lived beings have no time to waste on fear, she said. They forgot that emotional beings will fight to the death for what they love, and they forgot that fragile beings learn very quickly how to break things. We are not obsolete, she declared. We never were, and we never will be, and anyone who thinks otherwise is welcome to test that theory. The chamber erupted in sounds of approval and agreement from 2,000 species who had chosen to stand with humanity. Outside, the great window stars burned in the endless darkness, and ships from 100 different civilizations moved through space on missions of exploration and trade and hope. The galaxy had declared humanity obsolete, and humanity had responded by refusing to die, and then by building something better than what had tried to destroy them. It was not a perfect ending, because perfect endings did not exist in the real universe, but it was a beginning, and for a species that had been sentenced to extinction, that was more than enough. Elena Vasquez looked out at the stars and thought about the future that her species had seized. With both hands they had come so close to oblivion, and now they stood at the center of a new galactic order that they had built from the ashes of the old. Not bad for an obsolete species.